Have I got Jonathan in today?
It's not, you know, for them to be
Elsie.
aggressive with it.
Obviously,
Jonathan?
No.
oh,
Oh,
Fleming.
lady, so difficult. I mean,
They may be good thing they're
I
on.
don't know what the answer is because people seem to think it's all gone away. And
Right, everyone, good morning.
And, you know, when I went to my meeting, I've got my national shield on. Nobody could hear me.
Well,
And I got a bit frustrated. So I was all on my own, all up at one end. And I did. And somebody came to talk to me and I hadn't seen
No,
them.
they'll go when they mute them.
But I still felt very, very uncomfortable because, as you know, I don't usually go around without my shield. And I would love to have sat
The
in the
host
meeting.
Morning,
will
everyone.
mute everybody.
Let's make a
Not
start if we may.
organised enough.
you take it off.
Yeah.
Mute them all.
Nice to see you all. Got no. Sorry, things are a little bit odd this end. Let's see whether we can. Yeah, no, Judy. Right, we'll make a start. Welcome. I hope you've got the notes. There's Jonathan. Make him a co-host. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Good. I shall hand straight over to Judy, who's here, raring to go. Thank you, Judy.
Morning, everybody. Lovely to see you again. Nice that you're there, Jonathan.
Yeah.
So we're doing a period of history now, which is probably not taught at all. I can't remember learning this period of history. And I've mentioned it to other people, and they've said people who studied history to a high level, and they said they can't remember doing it either. We normally at school jump straight from Alfred to Ethelred and then to Canute, and all that we really know about them is sort of legends and stories. In terms of King Alfred, we know about the cakes, and that he was a good king, and our only king that was called Great, and that Ethelred was totally useless and got a really awful reputation. And then Canute, the only thing we know about him, I think, is that he asked for his throne to be taken down to the beach and told the tide not to come in. And then we jump straight to the Norman conquest, which is a strange way of teaching history, cherry picking, basically, just looking for something exciting to talk about to children. And that's what they remember. And that's what we remember. And there are sort of large chunks that are not mentioned at all. Long periods of time that we have no real knowledge of. Well, obviously we had ancestors living at this time, or we wouldn't be here today. What was it like for them during these periods of history that we don't learn about? And while I've been doing research for this, because I admit my own ignorance, I was amazed to find how turbulent this country became, how terrifying it must have been for our ancestors when the Danes, Norsemen, Vikings, they've got different names, were trying to conquer this country and making inroads, incursions, far up the rivers, and we are well served with rivers in this country, wide rivers. The Vikings, well, we'll say Danes, although they weren't all from Denmark. The Danes were absolutely brilliant at ship construction, and they had different types. By this time, they had different types of ship, and the narrow ones that they brought with them could slide up rivers because they were long and narrow, and our rivers are quite deep. And so they were able to raid inland and then steal horses and ride around, causing absolute chaos. It must have been a very, very, very difficult time for our ancestors to live through, trying to keep their farms going, trying to keep the supply, just being frightened all the time. Frightened of famine. We'll come to that, something else that we don't have to worry about. So the Norsemen's Revenge, I've called it that because obviously that after the St. Brice's Day massacre, I don't know whether King Ethelred thought that there would be no repercussions whatsoever. We don't quite know what his thought processes were. He thought he'd sorted them. He thought he'd frightened them, that it would be a deterrent that so many Danes had been murdered in cold blood, that would give us the edge. They wouldn't take us on anymore. They'd see what we were made of. Of course, it had exactly the opposite effect. The Norse decided that they needed to take revenge for this dastardly plot to kill them in cold blood after they had given they'd been told that they were going to the equivalent of a peace conference, and they'd surrendered their weapons. Constant attacks on church property had been taking place before the reign of Ethelred. And I have made a list because I found it quite impressive to have the dates and the places. Southampton attacked in 980, Thanet and Padstow in 981, Portland 982, Watchet 998, Cheshire also ravaged, plus Anglesey and Pembrokeshire in 991. 90 dragon ships attacked Folkestone, Ipswich, Sandwich. The only thing all these places have in common is that they're all coastal. And they burned down Exeter Monastery in 1002. That's the same year as the St. Brice's Day massacre. Wales was particularly targeted. I had no idea Wales was particularly targeted. That was never in any syllabus that I came across. I presume if you're Welsh, you would know that, but hopefully I admit my ignorance on that score. Anglesey repeatedly attacked because there were rich monasteries on Anglesey, and many abbeys and cathedrals were burned, their libraries were burned, and historians obviously say, why were Danes attacking in this savage way? And now it's been revealed by very, very diligent research that it wasn't just land hunger, because these attacks were really ferocious. And why were they attacking abbeys and cathedrals? It was very much due to hatred of Christianity. That they had their own gods and goddesses, and they were fighting to protect their own way of life, their own belief system. They had a great desire for precious artifacts. As we said before, the first raid on Lindisfarne was to take the church treasures. That was obviously very attractive, the idea that there was a sacristy full of precious objects which were very easy to steal. But why use fire? Why set fire to the libraries? You know, wanton destruction. They didn't want the books. They were illiterate on the whole, so they didn't want the books. They sometimes took the covers off the books because they had precious stones in the leather binding of the book, if it was a psalter or a prayer book. But otherwise, they weren't interested in the books themselves. So why did they set fire to them? Because they were worshipping their gods in terms of, it was a way of thanking their gods, of paying honour to them. Massive amount of destruction of, you could say, Christianity. The prayer books, the Bibles, all beautifully written out by hand by the monks, just destroyed in a few moments. And that must have been terrifying, watching the place that you love go up in flames. And the King of Denmark vowed to take revenge after the St. Brice's Day massacre. He was called Sweyn, nicknamed Forkbeard. People didn't have a surname in those days, what we call a surname, second name, but many of them, as we said already, had a nickname. And he was called Forkbeard. His father, Harold, you can spell it with an O or an A, but their way of spelling it was with an A. He was called Bluetooth, which suggests that in some encounter, either somebody had hit him in the face or he'd had an accident and his tooth had gone blue, it had sort of died. And so lots of people had, men in particular, had nicknames to differentiate them from other people with the same name. Swain's quite a common name. Swain Forkbeard. He was a very seasoned, we would say, pirate, raider, warrior. He already had a tremendous reputation in his homeland. What is spoken of in song and story. He already had he was a personality, he was a celebrity. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is our main source now for the information about this particular period, before the Norman conquest, before real history started, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle very good at attributing blame to people for the chaos that this country was facing. And one guy who gets it in the neck, Alderman Aelfric of Hampshire, gets an awful reputation, that when he saw the Danish army coming into Wiltshire, well, it's been in Wiltshire, now it's approaching Hampshire, as soon as he saw the Danish army, the poor guy started to throw up. He was so terrified, he started to be sick and ran away. Actually left his troops in the lurch. Which, there's no defence of this poor chap. He just gets told, the records say that he was an absolute coward and that he ran away and left them to be killed, left his troops to be killed. And then the following year, King Sweyn returned via Devon. Via Devon, attacked East Anglia. So they're now making inroads into the heart of the country. Destroyed Norwich, destroyed Thetford. And then somebody good comes along. Somebody with a reputation that gains a great reputation, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle said that this person resisted. Ulfkettle, what a brilliant name. Martin has sort of pointed out that some of these names are an absolute nightmare. Some of these Saxon names are very difficult to spell and equally difficult to say. We're not even quite sure how they were pronounced, but Ulfkettle is easy to say.
But typing up the notes is a nightmare.
Poor Martin, sort of struggling with these names. One thing that was obvious from these reports in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle of the devastation caused by these raiding parties was the absence of the king. Where was King Ethelred through all this? Why wasn't he leading his troops? Why wasn't he spurring them on and making encouraging speeches before battle? And where was he? And it's very hard to avoid the belief that he kind of opted out. Where was he? Was he hiding somewhere? Was he ill? We don't know. So we can interpret from the fact that he isn't mentioned that he wasn't behaving as a King of England should. And so King Sweyn becomes more and more of he is dominating the situation. Goes back to Denmark in 1005, and it's now believed that that was due to an appalling famine in England. Total, well, not total, but really awful crop failure. And that also should give us pause for thought that we're no longer living in a country that's being constantly raided by fierce pagan enemies, and we're not facing the fear of desperate hunger and death. And this is something our ancestors faced. The last great famine was in the reign of Edward II, before Black Death. From that point on, it sounds awful to say the Black Death, however awful something is, there is often a good a good side, if you look hard enough. There is even a benefit. The Black Death even produced a benefit in that it cut back the population. That sounds awful to say that, but in fact, it prevented famine. By the time the population was built up again to the original numbers and more, different farming techniques had kicked in, and there was never a great, sometimes called a great hunger. There was never a great hunger again. So we didn't have famines after the 14th century. Food shortages, yes, but not people actually dying of hunger. But there was a great famine before the Norman Conquest, so dreadful that the people were turning to cannibalism, not killing people to eat them, because that's what it is. The word cannibalism is a weasel word. It does sometimes imply that people are being killed and then eaten. They were eating the bodies, but I mean that's for Christians that is a dreadful thing to be forced to do. And again, we don't need to worry, as our ancestors did, about the weather. We complain about the weather, we comment on the weather. The British are famous for talking about the weather because it's so variable and used to be very unpredictable before weather forecasts. But we don't need to worry that strange weather conditions are destroying our livelihood. When we look up the sky and there's obviously going to be a rainstorm, we're not worrying about our crops. Farmers are worrying, but we are not. We don't need to, but our ancestors did. They were growing their own food. And I think we should bear that in mind when we're complaining about shortages and saying, oh, there aren't any eggs, or there aren't going to be any turkeys, or whatever it is, that we're not facing what our ancestors faced. Constant concern. When things were good, they were waiting for them to be bad. Not daring to believe that there would be a good harvest. Worrying about their animals because there was no way of curing anything. It was sometimes called a murrain, probably foot and mouth or swine fever. They had no way of curing their animals. So they were living in a state of constant anxiety, which we can hardly imagine. And it's true of many, many people, millions and billions of people all over the world who are growing their own food, looking at the sky, worrying about weather conditions, how it's going to affect their crops. Are they going to have enough to last through the winter until, well, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, to last through the winter, right through to the spring? Will there be enough to eat, keep the family alive? I think when things are grim, perhaps we could reflect on that and think how lucky we are that we don't have food shortages and that we're not thinking in terms of our very existence. When we look up into the sky and see a big black cloud appearing, we're not thinking that is going to ruin our wheat crop or our barley crop or our rye crop, whatever, oats. We're not going to die. Well, a lot of people died in this famine, this great famine, and that is recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So we were saved temporarily from the Norsemen, and by this time people were saying, well, the end of the world didn't come actually in the year 1000, but this is really a apocalypse time. This is the book of Revelation coming true, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Famine, and usually famine is followed by pestilence of some kind. It's followed by an outbreak of typhus or starvation, illnesses, because people haven't got any resistance. So people were thinking about the year 1000 as being very significant indeed. They expected the world to come to an end and the great day of judgment to take place, and it hadn't. But we're only a few years into the new millennium, and people are still feeling, our ancestors are still feeling really quite twitchy about it. And the church is emphasizing this. Don't get complacent, folks. You know, we're still in Millennium territory, and depending on how you read the Bible, this is the time when Satan is going to take over the world, and very shortly afterwards there will be a great day of judgment, the apocalypse, the day of doom, to use the Saxon word, doomsday. So something good did happen as a result of all this doom and gloom. King Ethelred decided to appoint some new advisors. He certainly needed some. Some advisors had given him extremely unfortunate advice. And the most prominent was Wulfstan, the Archbishop of York, who was a great scholar, writer, and the most powerful preacher. And the second new advisor was Edric, who got the nickname the Grabber. Says it all, really. Very ambitious, very self-centered, very dominant, dynamic, greedy, a layman, rose through the royal court to become an alderman. Alderman then was more important than an alderman now. Didn't just mean a sort of mayor's sidekick. It meant somebody with great authority at court, a nobleman, but also with territorial responsibilities. So Martin's found, and I certainly didn't know this, that Wulfstan's book is still in print. It's rather amazing. The political writings of Archbishop Wulfstan of York, and Martin's found a picture to show us
On Amazon.
on Amazon, which is amazing. Absolutely amazing. Archbishop Wulfstan would be well pleased if he knew his book was still in print and being sold. I'm absolutely amazed by that.
Judy, that's the point where I could make the observation about how difficult it is to find any pictures that are worth showing.
Yeah, I was just about to say that.
time. Yeah.
It is yes, Martin is brilliant at finding pictures and illustrations to go with the text that I deliver to him. He finds all the pictures, and he kept pointing out how difficult, just recently, how difficult it's been. And just to say that it is very difficult because our Anglo-Saxon ancestors were absolutely rubbish at drawing. Not just Anglo-Saxons, this continued throughout the Middle Ages, that a portrait wasn't a portrait. They just couldn't do a portrait. They drew like children, actually. I mean, they all look the same. You know, there's no way of distinguishing between one monarch and another. They just drew them all in the same way, like children do. You know, I'll put a crown on this person, and that will make them into a king. A sort of a bit of a sort of going off on a sideline. One of the most interesting things I can remember doing at university was talking about the Renaissance, and looking at pictures painted in or drawn in medieval times, which are fairly rubbish as drawings, as art, and then looking at Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and Holbein, the amazing accuracy. Well, let's concentrate on Holbein, the amazing accuracy of those portraits. So you feel you're really looking at the person. It's like a photograph. How did that happen? How come that for hundreds of years people couldn't draw for toffee, and then suddenly, well, it wasn't sudden, of course, but it appears suddenly that people could draw and paint so wonderfully well and so accurately with such skill. How did that happen? How come the Romans and the Greeks could sculpt so brilliantly? And then that skill didn't completely disappear, but medieval sculptings are very standardized and stylized, and they don't look like anyone in particular. Whereas the Greeks, the Romans, then there's this gap of not having skill, and then the Renaissance, skill again. Fascinating. So just something to think about, because I remember doing this course, and there are so many theories as to how it happened, but nothing really totally convincing to say, oh, of course, yes, that's why. There were just lots of different ideas as to how and why it happened, why the Renaissance took place when it did. But this early period, the illustrations are pretty epic. Martin said rubbish, very standardized and not particularly helpful. You know, there'd be a picture of Alfred and it just looks like all the others. So King Ethelred has appointed some better advice. Certainly Wulstan, absolutely outstanding, a real star, outstanding, standing out from all others at this particularly difficult time in our history. So King Ethelred is sort of under new management, you might say, and he begins to take advice, which we think he probably didn't before. He either took very bad advice or he thought he knew best, with fatal consequences. He now starts to behave more like King Alfred. He musters a great army to resist the Norsemen, raises taxes to pay for warships, which of course was one of the things that Alfred had done. Alfred gets the title of Father of the Royal Navy. Weapons and mail shirts, an early form of armour, very effective actually. It's like knitting with, or double knitting or crocheting using metal. I think I've mentioned this before, but we took a party of children to Warwick Castle, I remember, as a history trip, and they had a genuine piece of medieval chain mail on display, which I presume is still there. I haven't been to Warwick Castle for years, but probably still available. But it was great. They'd handed it around, let the pupils hold it, weighed a ton. They were all holding it out, holding their hands out, and then their hands were sort of sagging as this piece of chainmail, just a couple of feet across, square, was given to them, and they were straight away, oh, it's really heavy. And it moved, of course, it moved with the body, because it was sort of like double knitting. I say, I was crocheting, very, very skillful. A lot of metal rings that had all been sort of by hand locked into each other, but very effective apparently. Arrows bounced off it, and spears bounced off it, unless they were thrown with enormous force or fired with enormous force. Chainmail was effective. So 8,000 sets of armour and over 200 ships. The proviso when looking at these numbers is that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, like most chronicles, tended to exaggerate numbers or round up or round down. You know, we can't be absolutely certain about these numbers, but pretty impressive. At last, King Ethelred is doing something positive and sensible and fighting back instead of just letting the Norsemen swarm all over this country, burning and looting and pillaging, to use the old-fashioned word. And just as things seem to be improving, turning the corner, it all went horribly wrong. It'd be like people talk about a roller coaster. This is what happened during Ethelred's reign, and he was king for a long time. Rivalries in the royal court started to create problems, fatal arguments regarding strategies and tactics. There were still people saying, oh no, it's much easier to pay them off. Just keep them away, just keep paying them. Well, that'd be proved rubbish as well, because you pay them, they just keep coming back for more. The Norsemen took advantage of this situation. They had spies, obviously, in this country. They knew what was going on. And a great storm then, it seemed like as if God was angry with this country. Some people were saying the apocalypse is nigh. God is clearly very unhappy with this country. What on earth are we doing wrong to make him so displeased with us? Is it just the king he's displeased with? Or is it the whole English nation? Because a great storm then destroyed more than 100 of these ships which had just been built, and another failure of leadership resulted. And by August 1009, a huge raiding party had landed in Kent. A very famous celebrity Viking chieftain called Thorkel the Tall. Thorkel took tribute. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle said it was worth £3,000, which is a vast amount of money in those days. He then raided Sussex, Hampshire, and Berkshire. So obviously the bribe hadn't been, well, it wasn't a bribe, it was tribute, but equivalent of trying to pay him off. That had worked brilliantly. He just stayed here and ravaged more of this country. And King Ethelred, then desperate, not knowing what to do, what strategy to take, what to do, under the orders or the powerful suggestion of Wolston, said, you know, we've got to try and appease God. God is clearly very, very angry. We need to have a day of penance, a national day of penance. Well, the idea is impressive, and also the idea that by this time England was seen as a unit, that the king could order a national day of penance is significant in our history. That people, our ancestors again, would be expected to go to church and sing masses for hours, and they must not eat anything apart from herbs and bread, only very small amounts, and they mustn't drink ale or anything interesting. They must only drink water, and that was going to be a day or even a week of penance. It was up to individuals, but that one day particularly was going to be everybody following these instructions. Very impressive. Well, by the year 1010, the Great Heathen Army was established at Greenwich, and they ravaged Essex and Kent, sailed up the Thames, sacked Oxford. Nightmare. You know, the River Thames. Lovely river, but not if you're facing Viking incursions. The Thames, absolutely marvellous motorway. Lots of dragon ships making their way up the River Thames, and then when they couldn't go any further, they had lighter ships on board. They even constructed ships. They had carpenters on board that could make ships to go further up as the rivers narrowed or they went up tributaries. So they're now in the heartland of southern England, moving into the home counties, ravaging as they go. And the English just seem powerless to prevent these incursions. Canterbury, 1011, Canterbury fell. So we've got to try and imagine what it would be like living at that time, trying to keep your farm going, the clergy trying to keep services going, and all the time sort of looking over their shoulders, wondering when the next attack will come. I'm feeling helpless. The bishops of Rochester and Canterbury, the only area that had two bishops, Kent, Rochester and Canterbury, taken as prisoners of war and ransomed for £48,000. I mean, incredible amounts of money. Again, something you can say something good about this dreadful situation. How many other countries in Europe could have rustled up that much money? We were a rich nation, and a nation that could produce that amount of money. We had a system, a tax system, which was excellent, far better than most European countries. So there were things to be proud of in the midst of all this terrible chaos and suffering. And then an awful thing happened. It's a bit like the St. Brice's Day massacre, an act of, what do you say, infamy, of treachery, and a horrible incident. Archbishop, I don't know how to say this name. This is one of the names that Martin and I were saying. We don't know quite how to pronounce this. Alfrey, thank you. Whoever that was, thank you. Jonathan, thought it might be. Yes, thank you, Jonathan. Yeah. He refused to be ransomed out of sheer Christian reverence for the poor, you know, saying He was a humble man saying, I'm not valuable. I don't want to be ransomed. Give the money to the poor. And made a stand on principle. I don't want this vast amount of money to be used to ransom me. I'm not worth it. I'm unworthy. A good man, a good Christian man. And then famously or infamously, he was then murdered by Danes who had had far too much to drink and were out of control and just having fun. And they threw animal bones at him and killed him following a drunken feast. An absolute outrage to kill a good and a godly man in cold blood. Well, in hot blood, actually, because they were drunk. But a wicked thing to do. And he just stood there and they killed him. Even the Danes felt shame about this awful incident. They felt it reflected so badly on them. Yes, they were heathen. They didn't respect him as a Christian. In fact, they hated him as a Christian. But what a wicked thing to do, to murder an unarmed man. So it went against their principles as warriors, that you take people prisoner, but you don't murder them when they've surrendered their weapons. Of course, as a bishop, he'd not had any weapons at all anyway. So this was a bit of a turning point. And some oaths of peace were sworn at that time, and much of the great heathen army returned home. The Danes took this very much to heart. They felt that this brought shame upon them, this incident. Martin found a lot of information about what was known as the Great Heathen Army. And there's this lovely name, Avar the Boneless, in it. I just love that. But when I was young, learning about Avar the Boneless, and thinking, how on earth did he get that nickname? It sounds like a jellyfish. Is it, was he double jointed? One theory is that he had never had any broken bones, and many of the Vikings, of course, suffered from broken bones because of the violence of their fighting. They did get damaged, and it was possible to set bones in those days. There weren't cures for many things, but the clergy certainly had the monks, had a very good reputation for being bone setters, and very successfully able to get people, we'd say they were physiotherapists, getting people up and running again. So was Avar the Boneless somehow exempt? He didn't have those sort of injuries. He never broke any bones. Or one theory is that when people, when his enemy sort of fired arrows at him or threw spears at him, they never seemed to hit a bone. He never got knocked over or anything. He just carried on fighting. But I still have this childish idea that he was kind of squishy and couldn't stand up properly. Avar the Boneless. It's a lovely nickname, but it leaves you with questions. Now, coming up to the triumph of King Sweyn of Denmark, which is, when you think about it, an awful disgrace for this country. King Ethelred was not only seen as a coward and a man that had accepted bad advice or refused to take advice when he came up with an idea, but there were other reasons for hating him. His own subjects were turning against him. First of all, they were ashamed and embarrassed about his incompetence and deeply worried. I say our ancestors wanted strong leadership. They felt that was not being offered. And the Danish army was taking over in this country, quite obvious. They were roaming everywhere. They seemed to be unstoppable. Huge rises of taxation. And our ancestors were like people today. They did not like paying extra taxes unless they could see that the money was being well spent. They couldn't see that. They couldn't see much return for the huge increase in taxation to pay for the defence of the kingdom. Now, we had a good system. I know I keep saying that, but it can't be emphasised too much that it wasn't the Normans that came along and created systems in this country because they were so efficient. That was the way we were taught. absolute rubbish. The Saxons had excellent systems in place. They had sheriffs, shire reeves, local authority, which worked very well. And the sheriffs were responsible for collecting the taxes from each community. And the sheriffs were making people pay extortionate amounts of money, following command from the king. And the nobles had to pay high death duties, plus a new tax called Hergild, army money. Also, the king had done something very foolish. King Ethelred was keeping captured war gear. I mean, we didn't lose all the battles against the Danes. Every so often we won, and the Danes were defeated, and we took their weapons, their shields, their swords, their helmets, their jewellery. And if you remember, the tradition was that at the end of the battle, at the feast, you piled the war leader, the chief or whoever had led that particular battle, piled all the war gear. It was sort of in the middle of the room. There was a fire in the middle of the room, and then by the fire or round the fire was all this
spoils.
the stuff, or the spoils of war, the war gear that they'd captured, and it was distributed like medals and being mentioned in dispatches in the modern army. It was a way of congratulating and thanking the bravest of the warriors. But King Ethelred took it into his head to keep this war gear. I mean, again, what was he thinking? No wonder it was called Lack Council. What a foolish thing to do. It was the only good thing that was happening at the time, was that we were, on occasions, defeating the Danes in one small locality. There'd be a battle and they'd defeat a Danish raiding party. And the king was keeping the war gear, which was offending and enraging those who had been brave enough to fight. So he was making an awful lot of personal enemies, which he didn't seem to be aware of. Then 1013, King Sweyn led a full-scale invasion of this country and set up his headquarters at Gainsborough, using the River Humber and the River Trent. I mean, absolutely brilliant river, the Trent, navigable for many, many miles. Lovely, wide, deep river. Gainsborough set up his headquarters. And then, amazingly, English officials travelled to Gainsborough and bowed in homage to the Danish king. So this sounds like curtains for Ethelred. People are actually willing to turn traitor. And Sweyn had brought his son Knut, we call him Canute, much easier to say anyway. He brought his son with him. He went via Watling Street, the old Roman road, very, very lacking in repair by this time, but it was still better than going cross country. Travelled to Bath. He went cross country. He went to Winchester. He was given more homage and left for Bath. Western Thanes, those are like the noblemen, Saxon society. Thanes were the noblemen. The proper spelling is Thegns, but the modern way of spelling it is Thanes. They submitted to him. London followed. Ethelred is losing all credibility. And King Ethelred sent his sons, saw the writing on the wall, sent his sons for safety to Normandy. He fled to the Isle of Wight and then left for Normandy. And on Christmas Day, 1013, King Sweyn of Denmark was declared King of England. What an amazing thing to have happened. The Danes triumphed. He was already King of Denmark and of Norway. England had become a Danish outpost, which is probably why this is not taught. we're not looking good at this stage at all. It's probably why it isn't in most of the textbooks, and certainly not what we were taught at school. We kind of hop from Ethelred over to Canute. Canute seems a bit of a wally, with this episode on the beach, trying to stop the tide from coming in, and then we hop straight onto the background to the Norman conquest. But this is, well, it depends where you are. If you're Danish, obviously this is a high point. If you're English, it's a low point. And if you're impartial, if you don't care either way, it's just very interesting that the Danes have won. After years and years and years of just being raiding parties or settling, wanting land, they've now become the monarchy. So Sweyn organises his vast new kingdom, but then the English revive their hopes because they say, God is at work here. He'd only been king for 5 weeks and he died, which is also very dramatic. And we don't know, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle doesn't make it clear whether he was murdered or fell off a horse and his injuries killed, he died of his injuries. But he was buried in Denmark. But this is the reign of King Canute coming up. King Sweyn's eldest son, Harold, became king of Denmark. His youngest son, Canute, was proclaimed king of England by the inhabitants of the Danelaw. And there's a picture of King Canute with a funny big crown on him. They couldn't, the Saxons couldn't even make the crown fit. After they'd drawn somebody's head, they couldn't even make the crown fit, which is again like children that have no sense of proportion, and they just can't draw properly. So the English nobility sent for King Ethelred, exiled. He returned, managed to drive Canute out of England briefly, but on return he became king of all England in 1016, which is a date to conjure with, following the death of Ethelred and his son Edmund Ironside. In 1019, Canute becomes very, very famous indeed because he's king of Denmark, king of England, king of Norway, king of some parts of Sweden, Pomerania, and Schleswig. You might remember some 19th century Schleswig, Holstein becoming important. So massive amount of land. And how's he, how is he going to treat England? Are we just going to be a sideshow? Is he going to be a Scandinavian king? Spend most of his time in Scandinavia? No. He becomes one of, again, this is all kind of hushed up, an extremely good king of England. But because it was an embarrassment, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and other chroniclers don't really go on all that much about Canute, but they do say what an excellent king he was in terms of giving money to the church, extremely pious, Christian, which made all the difference. He was a Christian king, and he deserves praise. Perhaps he gets more praise in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle than possibly he deserves. So another thing to remember when we think looking for bias in history, looking for accuracy above all, historians now try to be even-handed. They try not to be partisan. They try to get at the truth by looking at many, many different sources of information and comparing them, which takes a very long time. Some people spend 20 years researching quite a narrow area of history because they're determined to get to the bottom of the claims and the counterclaims and whether this is actually true or whether it's a legend or whether it's just somebody that hates the person and is determined to rubbish their character. And it's a bit like journalism today. You read a paper, you read about somebody, and it's a very prejudiced, very biased point of view. You need to find out, well, try and find out what really happened or what they're really like, not just listen to one person who has an agenda. And the trouble with our ancient history, Well, it's never changed really, but certainly the further back we go, the fewer the sources are available. Have to be very careful not just to take what one source says as gospel, as true, absolutely true. And in medieval times, it was mainly monks who wrote the chronicles, wrote the dispatches, wrote the history, if you like. And they were obviously very prejudiced. So if a king or queen, well, we'll say king, if they gave money to the church, if they were pious, if they went to church regularly, heard mass regularly, went on pilgrimage regularly, they got a magnificent write-up from the chroniclers. If they mocked the church, if they didn't give generously, if they didn't go on pilgrimage, etc., then they got an awful write-up, and all their bad points were exaggerated. And they kept, like King John. King John wasn't such an awful king. The chroniclers wrote about him because he had a rather warped sense of humour, and he mocked the church and some of the ceremonials and rituals in the church. He got the most appalling write-up. The chroniclers, the people who wrote the information, were very prejudiced against him for obvious reasons. Canute, on the other hand, gets like a glowing reference because he was very pious. And as a result, he comes over as an excellent king. Certainly was a canny politician, we know that, but we'll prove that in a minute. A successful ruler. He was respected by his subjects, that is true. And he was determined to heal the divisions between his English and Danish subjects. So we've got the Danelaw, the north and the east, and then we've got the southern area, which was English. How is he going to reconcile the two after all this fighting that had been going on, all this destruction and murder in the case of the Archbishop? How was he going to reconcile the two, his Scandinavian subjects in England and his English subjects in England? How is he going to work out some kind of conciliation? Well, first of all, he spent a lot of money, personal money, showing contrition for the violent activities before his accession. Founding monasteries as acts of contrition. That went down brilliantly well, as you can imagine, with the monkish chroniclers. What a good guy. He visited the tomb of King Edmund Ironside at Glastonbury and donated a sumptuous cloak, which is described in great detail, embroidered with bejewelled peacocks. He gave a magnificent gift to King Edmund Ironside at Glastonbury, a martyr. Removing the remains of the martyred Archbishop from St. Paul's Cathedral to a splendid tomb in Canterbury Cathedral, which had been rebuilt after the Danish attacks. And then he married, this is a bit weird, he married Emma, widow of Ethelred the Unready, so he married an English queen, and she was delighted and flattered, but he already had a wife. And here she doesn't really explain how he sorted out the problem of having two wives at the same time. It was apparently, he asked the Pope's permission and the Pope said yes. It's a bit strange, but the new marriage brought him great popularity, that he was marrying, he married somebody English. And Henry of Huntingdon, who was writing quite a long time afterwards, a sort of retrospective, long after Knut had died, 3 memorable facts about him is that marriage to Emma, his negotiated reduction in tolls for English merchants travelling on the continent, and the famous beach or sea episode. Is it a legend or is it true? Because it's all most of us were taught about King Canute, not knowing it was a funny name. Told the sea to stop coming in because he was so big-headed, he was so conceited that he thought he could stop the tide from coming in. Well, the story has been presented in a completely misleading way. Because what in fact happened was that his courtiers were toadying, use an old-fashioned word, toady, I think we all know what it means. They were flattering him and going completely over the top, saying, "Oh, you're so wonderful, and you know got such power, and God has favoured you, and you'd probably even stop the sea from coming in." At which point he, as a good Christian, he thought, "This is outrageous. This is blasphemy. Comparing me with God, this is awful. I can't be doing with this. I've got to deal with it. This is sacrilegious and blasphemous." So he did order his courtiers to take his throne down to the beach when the tide was on the turn. And it was a parable. He commanded the sea to not come in and wet his feet. And then, of course, it did. And then he turned to his courtiers and said, "There now. How dare you compare my power with the power of God? God is in charge of everything. God is the creator. God is the great power of the universe. And you must never compare him with anybody else." It was a parable. So to say that it was because he was conceited is to completely misunderstand the point of this. It was like a visual aid that you use in school to make a point dramatically. Using a theatre workshop, it's sometimes called theatre, to make something drive the point home by something visual. And that's what he was doing. He was actually accepting his own place in the universe. Yes, he was a king, but God was completely in charge. God had created the sea and the waves and the tidal system. And how dare these sycophantic courtiers suggest anything other? He was putting them in their place. It was like an enormous reprimand. The king and queen are shown in various documents, various manuscripts, founding religious houses. One way of showing how they'd founded it was to show them holding a model, a bit like a Meccano model or a Lego model of their cathedral or church, actually holding it, sort of offering it to God. Many religious houses founded by them. And following the advice of Archbishop Woolston, who was still sort of like the Prime Minister, although there wasn't such a position in those days. The parish system was developed. Once the Danish incursions ended, most villagers that hadn't had a church, they'd had a preaching cross, built a stone parish church. And there are many churches now with Saxon remains. The churches have been rebuilt and modernized over the years as new architectural styles have come in. But you can probably think of churches you've visited where there is a section of the church which has still got some original Saxon architecture to show to the visitors. It might only be a column here, a pillar, or a window, or something in the crypt, but there is something to show that it was a Saxon foundation. It's not true that they couldn't build in stone. This sort of weird idea that they went on building in wood until the Normans came, and then, oh, magic, the Normans knew how to use stone. So did the Saxons. And the churches, of course, the parish system meant that communities developed with the church at the centre. And now peaceful conditions were prevailing, the parish system became very, very important. The point about King Canute is that he was a very good stabilising King of England. And obviously, the Danish incursions stopped. They got what they wanted. And if we do DNA now, my daughter did her DNA not long ago, a surprising number of people saying, "Oh, I've got Norwegian I've got Scandinavian in my ancestry. Why? We haven't got any family that come from Norway or Sweden or Denmark. How strange. Where's this come from?" Well, it's come from the fact that the Danelaw, the northern part, people intermarried. They married into the Saxon existing population, and we are a sort of mongrel race in many respects. what is interesting is there's hardly any Roman. There's hardly any Roman. Because we used to think that the Romans had been here such a long time that they'd intermarried. Probably not. They brought families over with them, and it was mainly a military setup. The Roman army, of course, wasn't all Italians, far from it. So people are really rather surprised. They're thinking there might be some Romans somewhere in their ancestry, but rather surprised to find a lot of Norwegian or Danish or Swedish in their ancestry. Scandinavian, basically. So Martin found some excellent appendices, and just to say, Canute fell ill in 1035. He was king for a long time. He died on November the 12th, 1035, and sadly, it's again back to chaos. His death resulted in a disputed succession, and eventually led to the coming to the throne of a subject. Because one of the things that I need to mention about Canute's reign was that he promoted and trusted an alderman called Earl Godwin, and the kingdom was chopped into 4 sections, almost going back to the original Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. That possibly because he was king of so many countries, King Canute very, very sensibly trusted other people. He was very good at choosing people that he could trust, unlike Ethelred, who obviously had advisors that were not very sensible or not very bright and didn't give good advice. Canute was good judge of character, and so he chose people and he made them into earls, not aldermen, but earls, what later became more like dukes. The Anglo-Saxon name for somebody, top aristocrat, was an earl, and Earl Godwin was not royal. He wasn't of royal blood. And interestingly, when the chaos kind of settled down, it was Earl Godwin's son, Harold, who became King of England after Edward the Confessor. A non-royal person. Interesting. So we've got shires, we've got parishes, we've got an excellent tax system, we've got reconciliation between the two groups of people. Although it has to be said, the Danes and the Saxons had many similarities. And so Canute's reign was a sort of haven of peace and conciliation, sandwiched between times of dynastic chaos, leading up. So next time it'll be the lead up to the Norman conquest. And I'm just going to read the Danegeld. I'm sure you've read it. Rudyard Kipling. I looked it up last night. It was written in 1911, and Rudyard Kipling loved history and took a great interest in history. He's a great poet. Had a great sense of humour. So this is written very tongue in cheek, very humorous, very humorous. But it was also written 1911, 3 years before the First World War broke out, at a time of international unrest. Again, there's sort of legends about, oh, nothing, everything was all lovely and peaceful, and Europe was all peaceful, and the weather was lovely, everybody was all happy. And then all of a sudden, this terrible war developed. This terrible war broke out in 1914, much to everybody's amazement. Well, it wasn't like that at all. It had been building up for years, and people had been predicting that there would be a huge war in Europe. There were so many tensions. There were so many issues. There were so many countries that needed to take revenge on another country, like France wanted to take revenge on Germany for the Franco-Prussian War, etc. Germany wanted to build up her empire. Germany feeling threatened by being surrounded, being a Central Europe, not Central Europe, but feeling of being surrounded, feeling paranoid. Russia wanting to expand, to the Turkish Empire sort of dying, or so many different, and Eastern Europe, cockpit of Europe, very, very unsettled indeed. So it wasn't true that just before 1914, everything in the garden was lovely and it was peaceful and wonderful. And that's when Rudyard Kipling wrote this called Danegeld, and it's so funny because it's sort of satire. It is always a temptation to an armed and agile nation to call upon a neighbour and to say, "We invaded you last night. We're quite prepared to fight unless you pay us cash to go away." And that is called asking for Danegeld. And the people who ask it explain, you've only to pay them the Danegeld and then you'll get rid of the Dane. It is always a temptation for a rich and lazy nation to puff and look important and to say, "Though we know we should defeat you, we have not the time to meet you. We will therefore pay you cash to go away." And that is called paying the Danegeld. But we've proved it again and again, that if once you have paid him the Danegeld, you'll never get rid of the Dane. It is wrong to put temptation in the path of any nation for fear they should succumb and go astray. So when you are requested to pay up or be molested, you will find it better policy to say, "We never pay anyone Danegeld, no matter how trifling the cost. For the end of that game is oppression and shame, and the nation that plays it is lost." It's so clever and funny, and it all rhymes so well. So that's the way we're going to end. And then next time it will be the lead up, which will be more familiar, the lead up to the great Norman invasion, which is when history all kind of started in this country. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Judy. As
Thank you,
usual,
Martin. Thank you, Judy.
lots of interesting stuff. We'll meet again in a fortnight. Thank you, everyone.